There are moments in a nation's life, a civilized nation anyway, when politics is supposed to stop. Not because the stakes aren't high, but because the pain is. Moments when a president isn't asked to legislate, persuade, or win, but simply to stand still, speak carefully, and remind people that they're not alone in their grief. Those moments don't require brilliance or even ideology. They simply require empathy. And the measure of a leader isn't how loudly they speak in those moments, but how much space they're willing to give to sorrow itself. I think we'd all probably agree on those points, most of us anyway. But this is 2025, and this is Trump 2.0. And things are very, very different. Happy holidays, everyone, and welcome. You are listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. Today, we're going to be talking about a skill that, while often overlooked, and hopefully not needed very often, is one that I believe is very, very important. Empathy. Over the years, there have been, sadly, far too many instances where a president has found himself in a position where he has to address the nation as they grieve. While other presidents that I have been around to hear handle these situations do so with sensitivity and skill and dare I say, maturity, such is not the case of our current president. Today's main topic will dig into this concept a bit, but before we do that, let's look at some hot topics. So if you listened to Friday's installment of Back Porch Files, you knew it was supposed to be a big day, December 19th. But Friday came and went, and with it came what we were told would be a long-awaited moment of transparency, the release of the Epstein files. What the public actually received, though, was not transparency. It was a tease, a heavily redacted, carefully curated sliver of documents released just before the weekend, designed to technically satisfy a deadline while revealing as little as possible. And that distinction matters because the legal requirement wasn't that some files be released, it was that the files be released. All of them, by that date. That did not happen. Instead, what we got was the bureaucratic equivalent of someone sliding a manila folder across the table, smiling politely and saying, "Here you go," while knowing full well that most of the pages inside are blacked out, missing, or conspicuously incomplete. Names are obscured, context is stripped away, entire sections are rendered unreadable. And somehow, almost magically, some very powerful people appear to be nowhere to be found. Which, of course, brings us to the most glaring absence of all, Donald J. Trump. Now, let's be very clear here, because this is where bad faith actors love to start screaming conspiracy. No one is claiming that Trump's name appearing in these files would automatically prove criminal wrongdoing. That's not how evidence works. But what is beyond dispute, because it's been documented repeatedly over the years, is that Donald Trump knew Jeffrey Epstein very, very well. He socialized with him, he partied with him, he spoke publicly about him. There are photos, there are quotes, there are flight logs that raise eyebrows, even if they don't end conversations. So, when a supposedly comprehensive release of the Epstein-related documents drops, and Trump's name is nowhere to be found, not redacted, not contextualized, not even mentioned, it's not just surprising, it's suspicious. And of course, I'm not the only one who's noticed. Because this wasn't some obscure association that only internet sleuths dug up years later. Trump himself talked about Epstein in glowing terms back in the early 2000s, famously saying Epstein liked women, quote, on the younger side. That quote alone should have ensured that Trump's name appeared somewhere in these documents, even if only as background. The idea that he's completely absent strains credibility. And that's the core problem with this release. It asks the public to suspend common sense. Now, we're told this is about protecting privacy, about avoiding defamation, about not re-traumatizing victims, and those concerns are real. No one serious disputes that. But when redactions consistently shield the powerful while leaving the public with scraps, the stated justification starts to feel less like caution and more like convenience. Especially when the deadline was not optional. The law was explicit. These files were supposed to be released in full, subject to narrow and justified redactions. What happened instead looks a lot like deadline theater. A Friday news dump, just enough compliance to say, we release something without actually complying with the spirit, or arguably the letter, of the order. And Congress seems to be paying attention. Several lawmakers from both parties have already raised alarms about the scope of the redactions and the limited nature of the release. Some have publicly questioned whether the Justice Department is slow-walking disclosure. Others have suggested that additional subpoenas or hearings may be necessary to determine who made the call to withhold certain materials and why they did it. And let's pause there for a moment, because that's not normal. When members of Congress are openly questioning whether a law-mandated document release was intentionally diluted to protect political figures, that's not business as usual. It's institutional distrust. That's lawmakers signaling, carefully but clearly, that something about this doesn't pass the smell test. There's also the question of timing. Releasing these documents on a Friday with minimal, if any, explanation and no comprehensive briefing wasn't accidental. Friday releases are designed to limit coverage, to let outrage burn itself out over the weekend, to ensure that by Monday morning the news cycle has moved on. If you ever watched the old show The West Wing, they referred to it as Take Out the Trash Day. The day they brought out stories that were going to be unpopular because they knew far less people would be watching the news. But this time it doesn't seem to have worked that way. Because people aren't just asking what was released, they're asking what wasn't. They're asking why certain names appear repeatedly while others, names we already know are connected, are nowhere to be found. They're asking why entire passages are blacked out with no explanation. They're asking who decided what the public was allowed to see and under what authority. And that brings us to what could happen next. Legally, there are a few paths forward. One is judicial intervention. If the court determines that the release did not meaningfully comply with the law, with the bill as signed, it can demand additional disclosure, require explanations for the redactions, or set a new, firmer deadline with consequences attached. That process is slow, but it does exist. Another path is congressional pressure. Committees can request documents directly. They can call DOJ officials to testify. They can force answers in public hearings where ongoing process stops being a sufficient response. That route depends heavily on political will and on whether lawmakers are willing to endure the backlash that inevitably follows when powerful people feel threatened. Also, let's not forget, we've talked about this recently, that as of late, answers in congressional hearings where the people testifying are under oath have been lackluster to say the least and perjury to say the most. There's also the possibility of investigative journalism filling in the gaps, as it often does when official channels fail. Reporters have been digging into Epstein's network for years. A partial release doesn't stop that work, it fuels it. Every blacked out name becomes a question mark. Every missing page becomes a lead. And then, of course, there's the political dimension, which cannot be ignored. Because Donald Trump is not just a former president, he's a current president. Any suggestion, however indirect, that he is being shielded from scrutiny lands in an already volatile environment. The same man who endlessly claims persecution, suddenly benefiting from institutional opacity, is not a good look, no matter how you slice it. Trump has spent years insisting that shadowy elites are hiding the truth, that powerful interests manipulate the system to protect themselves, and that the public is being lied to. And now, in one of the most high-profile transparency moments in recent memory, his name is mysteriously absent from a document trove tied to a man he publicly associated with. You don't have to believe in grand conspiracies to find that ironic. What's more troubling, though, is what this episode says about accountability. Epstein's crimes weren't isolated. They were enabled. They were ignored. They were protected by silence, influence, and institutional failure. A meaningful release of these files was supposed to be a step toward reckoning with that reality. Not just with Epstein himself, but with the whole ecosystem that allowed him to operate as he did. Instead, all we've gotten so far at the deadline is half answers and black boxes. And that has consequences. Because every time transparency is promised and not delivered, public trust erodes a little more. Every time powerful figures appear insulated while ordinary people are exposed, cynicism deepens. And every time institutions tell us this is all you need to know, when it clearly isn't, the space for speculation and misinformation grows. That, of course, is not good for justice. It's not good for democracy. It's certainly not good for the victims whose story deserves more than redacted footnotes. So no, this isn't over. This release didn't close the book on Epstein by any stretch of the imagination. It didn't even really turn a page. At best, it cracked the spine and hoped no one would notice the missing chapters. And judging by the reaction so far from lawmakers and journalists and the public, that hope was misplaced. The question now isn't whether more information exists. We know it does. The question is whether the institutions tasked with releasing it are willing to do so honestly, fully, and without regard for who might be embarrassed or exposed along the way. Because accountability that stops just short of power isn't accountability at all. It's performance. By the time most people even heard that Donald Trump had renamed the Kennedy Center, the physical evidence was already there. The signage has changed. The letters are up. For decades, what has stood as a living memorial to President John F. Kennedy, one of the few genuinely bipartisan symbols in American civic life, had been altered not through public debate, not through congressional consensus, but through executive ego and a board vote so choreographed it borders on parody. And that's the thing about this move. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't even particularly strategic. It was blunt, theatrical, and, like so much of what goes on with Trump, it was deeply revealing. The Kennedy Center isn't just another federal building. It's not a post office or an office complex that quietly bears a name no one thinks about. It's a cultural institution built explicitly to honor a president who believed that art, culture, and public life were inseparable. John F. Kennedy didn't see the arts as decoration. He saw them as a reflection of national character. That's why the center exists. That's why his name is on it. Trump's decision to change that name and add his own through a board he personally handpicked and which he personally chairs is not just controversial, it's farcical. Let's talk about that board for a moment because it's central to understanding just how hollow this process was. The vote to rename the Kennedy Center was unanimous. unanimous. Not because the idea was universally beloved, but because dissent was structurally impossible. Trump selected the board. Trump installed loyalists. Trump chairs the board. A unanimous vote under those conditions is definitely not surprising and definitely not democracy. It's a rubber stamp with better catering. This wasn't a deliberative body wrestling with history and public responsibility. It was a vanity committee executing the wishes of the man who put them there. Calling that a board decision is like calling applause at a campaign rally spontaneous. And yet, even that shouldn't have been enough, because Congress is supposed to be involved in changes like this. The Kennedy Center was created by an act of Congress. Its name isn't a branding opportunity. It's part of its legal and historical identity. Renaming it is not meant to be a private board matter, no matter how obedient that board may be. It's supposed to involve legislative oversight, debate, and public accountability. That didn't happen. Instead, Congress was effectively bypassed, sidelined, or dared to object after the fact, I guess. The name was changed first, questions then asked later. And as the public was left staring at the new signage like it was a fait accompli. That's not how democratic processes are supposed to work, especially when dealing with national memorials. And it's not just procedurally offensive, it's morally offensive. John F. Kennedy represents something Trump has never understood and never valued. The idea that public service is about something larger than yourself. Kennedy spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about civic duty, about cultural investment, not because it polled well, but because he believed a great nation should aspire to be more than wealth and power. Trump, by contrast, sees naming as ownership. He slaps his name on things the way developers do: hotels, towers, golf courses. And we know where he learned that. To him, renaming the Kennedy Center isn't a historical revision. It's a branding upgrade. Another notch on his ego belt. Another physical reminder that he was here, that he mattered, and that his name must endure whether it belongs or not. And that's why this move feels so gross. It's not just about Trump liking his name in big letters. It's about tainting someone else's legacy to make room for his own. It's about taking a space dedicated to art, reflection, and national memory and turning it into a monument to self. The reactions to this have been swift and visceral, particularly from the Kennedy family. And that reaction matters because if anyone has standing to object, it's the family whose name was placed there intentionally, thoughtfully, and with overwhelming public support. The Kennedys didn't seek this out. They didn't lobby for it. The country chose to honor JFK because his vision helped shape the institution itself. Changing the name of that institution without congressional debate, without the Kennedys' consent, without public buy-in is not just disrespectful, it's an insult. Members of the Kennedy family have described the move as crass, inappropriate, and fundamentally misunderstanding what the center was meant to represent. They've pointed out correctly that the Kennedy Center was never meant to glorify power or wealth, but creativity and dialogue and the shared cultural life of the nation. Trump's name, whatever else one thinks of it, carries none of that symbolism. And of course, this is where Trump's defenders predictably roll their eyes and say, "Oh, it's just a name." But it isn't. Names are meaning. Names are memory. Names are signals about what we value and who we choose to honor. You don't rename Arlington Cemetery because you feel like it. You don't rename the Lincoln Memorial because a board vote went your way. These places exist above individual ambition, or at least they're supposed to. Trump doesn't believe in that kind of restraint. This is the same man who wanted his face on Mount Rushmore, the same man who suggested rewriting history books to flatter his administration, the same man who confuses applause with admiration and loyalty with legitimacy. Renaming the Kennedy Center isn't a departure from that pattern. It's a pure distillation of it. And let's be honest about something else here. this wasn't about honoring the arts. Trump has never shown sustained interest in supporting the arts unless they benefit him personally. His budgets repeatedly proposed cuts to arts funding. He mocked cultural institutions. He treated artists as enemies if they criticized him and props if they praised him. His relationship to culture has always been transactional and defensive. So when he claims this renaming is about legacy or leadership, it rings hollow. It's about permanence. It's about carving his name into the civic landscape so it can't be ignored or forgotten. It's the logic of insecurity masquerading as confidence. What makes this especially galling is the contrast between Kennedy's humility in public life and Trump's hunger for adoration. JFK's name ended up on the Kennedy Center because others believed he deserved it. Trump's name is going up on it because he demanded it and had the power to make it happen. And those are not the same thing. And there's a broader danger here, beyond one building and any one name. When presidents start renaming national institutions to honor themselves, we drift away from the democratic tradition and toward something a whole lot uglier. It starts to resemble the behavior of strongmen who plaster their names on airports and stadiums and monuments to signal dominance rather than service. It's a personalization of the state, where public spaces become extensions of an individual ego. And that should worry people regardless of political party. Because today it's the Kennedy Center. Tomorrow it's something else. Once the norm is broken, it doesn't magically repair itself. It invites imitation. It invites escalation. And it invites the idea that power entitles you not just to govern, but to rewrite national memory. Trump's defenders will argue that Kennedy was a politician too, and that he wasn't perfect, that his legacy is complicated. And all of that is true and irrelevant. Memorials aren't about perfection. They're about meaning. And the meaning of the Kennedy Center was never partisan dominance. It was aspiration. Trump does not aspire. He accumulates. This renaming doesn't elevate the center. It diminishes it. It turns something dignified into something petty. It takes a space meant to bring people together through art and drags it into the swamp of personal grievance and self-promotion. And perhaps most telling of all is how unnecessary it was. Trump didn't need to do this. There was no public demand. There was no crisis he was solving. No movement calling for change. He did it because he could. Because the board would comply. Because resistance was weak. Because his name is the one thing he trusts to endure. That's not leadership. That's narcissism with stationery. And long after the signage comes down, because history has a way of correcting these things, the ugliness of this moment will remain as a reminder of what happens when ego outruns judgment. When institutions meant to serve the public are bent to flatter one man. When the past is treated not as inheritance, but as raw material to be reshaped for personal glory. John F. Kennedy once said that life is unfair, and we must learn to deal with it. Trump's response to that idea has always been to insist that fairness means constant recognition, constant affirmation, and constant deference. Renaming the Kennedy Center doesn't make Trump bigger. It just makes the pettiness harder to ignore. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the recent Turning Point USA rally in Phoenix, the so-called AmericaFest, hosted by Erica Kirk, the widow of Charlie Kirk. On the surface, it was billed as a major gathering for the conservative movement, a sort of youth-driven festival of MAGA politics and political spectacle. But what it actually looked like, and what a lot of people felt like they were watching, was something closer to a carnival sideshow than a serious political event. There were fireworks and flashy staging and sparkly outfits, personal tributes that veered into promotional theater, and a general tone that felt like a competition for who could generate the most attention rather than a moment of unified political purpose. It was as though someone had taken a political rally, a music festival, and a reality TV production and thrown them into a blender with the volume turned up and called it a conservative movement reinvigorated. And Erica Kirk herself was at the center of it all, standing on that stage in outfits that looked more suited to a Las Vegas lounge act than a political conference, telling the crowd that AmericaFest was, quote, not boring, end quote. That line alone, delivered with a grin, tells you everything you need to know about the tone of the event. Chaotic, performative, pushed past political substance into pageantry. But it wasn't just the aesthetics. The event has exposed, very publicly and unfiltered, deep, uncomfortable rifts within the Republican coalition. This wasn't just a rally, it was a battlefield where conservative personalities and factions squared off with one another on and off the main stage, often spending more time attacking each other than the left or the Democrats. That's not rhetorical flourish. That's mood. It's a movement in visible, messy conflict. When major players who used to operate in the same orbit start calling each other out in public, that's more than sniping. It's evidence of a fracture. Ben Shapiro, for example, used his platform at the event not just to discuss policy, he took direct aim at other conservative commentators, accusing figures like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and Steve Bannon of being frauds, grifters, or otherwise unprincipled in ways that shocked parts of the crowd and drew immediate backlash. And that tells you something. At a moment when Republican voters are trying to figure out what comes after Trump, because the 2028 landscape is wide open, the expected cohesion just isn't there. Instead, what we got was a factional free-for-all. When personalities who once campaigned under the same broad tent turn on each other in public, it's not just theatrical. It's a warning sign of a movement losing its mooring. And lots of this stems from the way Turning Point USA has handled its transition since Charlie Kirk's assassination in September. Erica Kirk, who took over as CEO of the organization, promised continuity. She spoke about her husband's mission, she talked about honoring his legacy, and she moved quickly to frame Turning Point as a central player in conservative politics moving forward. And she did so with energy, but also with theatrics that made some inside and outside the movement a bit uncomfortable. There were the scenes that looked like tributes, celebration of memory, but in practice crossed a line into spectacle. Videos circulated of hats and merchandise being handed out to crowds, events that some attendees found uplifting and others found tone-deaf, or exploitative given the context of her husband's violent death. And then there are the reports, some of them circulating online, about replica displays or memorial installations at the event that critics said were in poor taste or sensationalized what was in reality an extremely traumatic moment in conservative circles. While these particular accounts aren't mainstream news reports, they've been widely shared and reflect the intensity of reaction from people on social media. Specifically, one of the things they were talking about was a mock-up of the tent where Charlie Kirk was sitting when he was assassinated, where folks could come and sit and take selfies of themselves, sort of in the seat. And all this brings us to a stark truth. This event wasn't just about policy direction or the next election cycle. It was, consciously or not, a crucible for personal ambitions and ideological splits. Erica Kirk used her time on the main stage to endorse Vice President J.D. Vance for the 2028 Republican nomination, calling him my husband's friend, and pledging Turning Point's support to help elect him. That's a major political move, signaling a new power player and a potential next generation of GOP leadership. But even that endorsement couldn't paper over the fact that the crowd was split and the rhetoric was increasingly centered not on defeating Democrats, but on who has the authority and purity to lead the right wing's internal coalition. When speakers are spending more time calling out fellow conservatives than targeting political opposition, that's not just division. It's a crack in the foundation. And this splintering shows up elsewhere, too. Some personalities, once staples of MAGA media, barely got airtime or acknowledgement at the event, drawing public criticism from commentators who felt left out or sidelined. Meanwhile, others like Shapiro were given platforms to air grievances that go well beyond normal pundit debate. What you're seeing here is less unity and more intra-movement grievance theater, where different camps are vying for legitimacy, influence, and narrative control. Tucker Carlson, for instance, tried to play it down, calling talk of GOP civil war overblown, but his attempt at humor undercut the seriousness of what was actually happening. A very real sense that the movement is splitting into factions with different priorities and different strategies and certainly different personalities. Meanwhile, figures like Steve Bannon hinted that this was only the beginning, that more confrontations were coming. You don't make that kind of comment if everything's harmonious. You make it when alliances are fragile and loyalties divided. And let's not overlook the optics. This event, with its bright lights and loud music and pageantry, created an impression that some conservatives saw as a circus. That's not just snark. When the vibe of a high-profile conservative summit resembles a game show more than a political strategy meeting, it's fair to call it a clown show. The visuals and theatrics matter because they shape how the movement is perceived, not just by opponents, but by potential allies and donors and voters. But this split isn't just about personalities, it's about competing visions for what conservatism means in the post-Trump era. There isn't a single cohesive strategy emerging. There are loud voices with very different takes on foreign policy, on culture wars, on how much the movement should lean into Trumpism versus something new. Erica Kirk's rally, perhaps unconsciously, became a snapshot of that struggle. And that's the real takeaway here. What should have been a moment of unity and tribute turned into something else entirely, a mirror reflecting the fractures in the modern Republican coalition. You don't have internal feuds spat publicly unless something foundational is unsettled. The big takeaway from Turning Point's AmericaFest isn't just that the rally was chaotic. It's that the conservative movement, long held together, for better or worse, by a broad umbrella around Donald Trump, is now searching for what comes next. And until that next chapter is clearly defined, you're going to see more of these spectacles where faction clashes are not exceptions, but the main show. So yes, fireworks and sparkly outfits, but beneath the surface, a deeper story, a movement divided, personalities clashing, factions jockeying for position, and a political coalition that's no longer sure of its own identity. And if Turning Point's chaotic convention in Phoenix was any indicator at all, the Republican Party's internal rifts aren't just headlines. They're becoming the defining conflict of the next political era. And that brings us to this episode's main topic. Now, if you know anything about me at all, you might know that I'm a sucker for documentaries. I watch documentaries all the time. And I recently watched one that I highly, highly recommend. It's currently airing on HBO Max, and it's called Space Shuttle Columbia, The Final Flight. It's a 3-episode piece about just what the name signifies, the final flight of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which ended in disaster when it exploded upon re-entry. So as I'm watching this documentary, there was something that caught me off guard. And not because it was dramatic, but because it was sort of quiet. It was just added for a little bit of atmosphere. After the shuttle disintegrates on reentry and the 7 astronauts are lost, the documentary then shows President George W. Bush addressing the nation. He doesn't speculate. He doesn't assign blame. He doesn't wedge in a policy agenda or tout things that he's accomplished or take a swipe at his critics. He speaks slowly. He names the astronauts. He talks about grief, about loss, about the courage it takes to explore the unknown. And whether you agreed with George W. Bush politically or not, and I usually didn't, what you're watching in that moment is a president doing something essential by helping a grieving nation breathe. He's leading. And it hit me watching this documentary that this ability to meet tragedy with humanity, to lower the temperature instead of raising it, is one of the most basic leadership skills that a president can have. Not charisma, not policy chops, not even, sheer intelligence for that matter. Just the capacity to say, this hurts. We are hurting together. And right now, politics can wait. And it occurred to me that of all the leadership skills that Donald Trump seems to be missing, this ability to console without self-promoting is perhaps the one I miss the most in a president. Trump doesn't just struggle with empathy, he actively rejects it. He treats tragedy not as a moment to unify, but as a stage, an opportunity to score points, assign enemies, inflame resentment, and keep the political fight going even when the bodies are still warm. And that isn't just tasteless. It isn't just cruel. It actively deepens the vitriol that's tearing this country apart. Because when the president can't model basic human compassion, why would anyone else feel obligated to? Historically, presidents have understood that moments of national grief are different. They require a different tone, a different language, a different posture. After the Challenger disaster in 1986, Ronald Reagan postponed the State of the Union and addressed the nation not as a politician, but as a mourner. He spoke directly to children who had watched the launch in classrooms. He quoted poetry. He reassured a shaken country that exploration and hope would continue. You can argue Reagan's policies all day long, but in that moment, he understood the assignment. After the Oklahoma City bombing, Bill Clinton stood at a memorial service and delivered one of the most emotionally resonant speeches of his entire presidency. He didn't demonize political opponents. He didn't exploit the attack to push legislation in that moment. He spoke about the corrosive power of hate, about how words matter, about how leaders have a responsibility to lower the temperature rather than raise it. And he did so knowing full well that the attacker had been motivated by extremist rhetoric that thrived on grievance and paranoia. After 9/11, George W. Bush's approval ratings didn't skyrocket because Americans suddenly loved his policy positions. They rose because people felt steadied by a president who, at least in those early days, spoke with gravity and restraint. He went to memorials. He met families privately. He avoided campaign-style language because he understood that grief is not a rally. Barack Obama, criticized relentlessly by conservatives as cold or detached, demonstrated this instinct repeatedly. After Sandy Hook, he wiped away tears as he spoke the names of the murdered children. After the Charleston church massacre, he delivered a eulogy that centered the victims, acknowledged America's racial wounds, and ended by singing Amazing Grace. You don't have to agree with Obama politically to recognize that those moments mattered. They helped people feel seen. Now contrast that with Donald Trump. Trump does not pause politics for tragedy. He accelerates it. When conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated in September, the country was presented with a moment that demanded restraint and compassion. A young man had been murdered. A family had been shattered. Political violence, already a raw and terrifying reality, had claimed another life. This should have been a moment for a president to speak carefully, to condemn violence unequivocally, to urge calm, and to resist turning grief into fuel. Trump did none of that. Instead, while offering nominal condolences, he immediately blamed the radical left, declared Kirk a martyr, and framed the murder as proof of political persecution. He urged supporters to seek, quote, revenge at the voter box, end quote. At the memorial service, Trump told the crowd that while Kirk didn't hate his opponents, that Trump did. Quote, I hate my opponents, and I don't want the best for them, end quote. Not at a rally, not on Truth Social, at a memorial. That isn't leadership. That's emotional arson. A president setting aside empathy to declare hatred in a room filled with mourners isn't just revealing his character. He's modeling behavior. He's telling millions of people that grief is a weapon, that rage is righteous, that political opponents are not fellow citizens, but enemies undeserving of goodwill. And then we act surprised when the country feels perpetually on edge. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was textbook Donald Trump. Earlier in 2025, after the deadly midair collision near Washington, D.C. that killed 67 people, Trump opened with a moment of silence, then immediately pivoted to blaming diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Before investigations were barely even started, before families had buried their dead, Trump suggested that DEI hiring had lowered standards. When challenged, his response wasn't humility or caution, it was arrogance. Quote, because I have common sense, he said. That's not compassion. That's opportunism. Go back farther. After the 2019 mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, Trump mixed calls for unity with defensive attacks on critics who linked his rhetoric to the El Paso shooters' manifesto. He dismissed those concerns as political gain, blamed video games and mental illness, and then tried to shoehorn immigration reform into the conversation, as if grieving families were a legislative opening. After the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, where 11 Jewish worshippers were murdered by a white supremacist, Trump speculated, within hours, that the outcome might have been far better if the synagogue had an armed guard. He used the massacre to revive his death penalty rhetoric. And later that same day, he went ahead with the political rally and attacked Democrats like nothing had happened. Think about that. 11 people gunned down in a house of worship, and the president couldn't even give it 24 hours before returning to standard issue campaign bile. After an ISIS-inspired truck attack in New York City in 2017, Trump immediately called for tougher immigration laws and less political correctness. The victims were barely identified before policy talking points were deployed. Even natural disasters aren't spared. Hurricanes become chances to smear political rivals. Wildfires become vehicles for conspiracy theories. Disaster aid becomes a cudgel. The suffering of ordinary people is filtered through one question. How can I make this about me? And this is where the deeper damage lies. When a president treats tragedy as a political tool, it doesn't just cheapen the moment. It corrodes the culture. It teaches people that empathy is weakness, that restraint is surrender, that compassion is optional if it conflicts with your agenda. It tells grieving families that their pain is secondary to the message. It tells the country that unity is conditional. Trump often brags about being authentic, about saying what others won't. But this isn't honesty. It's a refusal to grow. Leadership sometimes means not saying the thing you want to say. It means recognizing that your role is not to win the argument in every single room, but to carry the emotional weight of the nation when it's hurting. And Trump can't do that. Trump cannot do that because he doesn't see the presidency that way. He sees it as a megaphone, not as a mantle. That's why in moments that cry out for humility, Trump offers grievance. In moments that demand comfort, he offers combat. In moments that require silence, he demands attention. George W. Bush didn't talk about politics when the Columbia crew was lost. He talked about loss and about courage and about shared mourning. That didn't make the tragedy disappear, but it helped the country process it together. Trump, by contrast, doesn't process grief. He exploits grief. And when the most powerful person in the country models that behavior, it sends a signal that reverberates downward. It legitimizes cruelty. It validates rage. It ensures that even in our darkest moments, we can't stop fighting each other long enough to heal. Empathy isn't a soft skill. It's a stabilizing force. It's how leaders keep nations from tearing themselves apart when tragedy strikes. Trump's inability, or unwillingness, to exercise it isn't just a personal failing. It's a national liability. Because if a president can't act like a compassionate human being when compassion is most needed, then what he's really saying is there is no moment sacred enough to put politics aside. And that's not strength. That's emptiness. All right, so before we wrap things up for this episode, I'd like to end on a high note. This episode should drop on December 22nd. So I want to tell you a story that has a little bit of everything to do with Christmas. So shortly before Christmas, in a city that knows something about winter and resilience, a cider brewery in Chicago stopped being a place where people gathered for drinks and turned into something else entirely. Tables were pushed together, boxes stacked high, volunteers moved in coordinated chaos, sorting groceries, folding winter coats, packing toys, slipping handwritten notes into bags, notes written in Spanish, meant to be read quietly, privately, by families who need to hear one simple thing. You are not alone. They called it Operation Midway Bliss. The name itself is a quiet act of defiance. It's a deliberate contrast to the anxiety hanging over many immigrant families in Chicago right now, driven by fears of stepped-up enforcement, raids, and the constant uncertainty of living under policies that treat human beings like targets. Where the government has talked about crackdowns and blitzes, this group responded with kindness, logistics, and care. On December 20th, volunteers delivered groceries, winter clothing, toys, and supplies to more than 100 immigrant families. Families that include roughly 170 children. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were practical, tangible acts of support. Food people could cook, coats people could wear, toys children could wake up to on Christmas morning and just be kids for a while. The effort was organized by William McNiff, working alongside the group Children of Migrants, and funded by everyday people who chipped in through a GoFundMe campaign that raised about $35,000. That number matters, but what matters more is how it was used, not for overhead, not for optics, but directly for families who needed help right now. There's something profoundly human about the way this was done. Along with food and clothing, volunteers included handwritten notes of encouragement. No slogans, no lectures, just words meant to remind families that someone sees them, values them, and cares what happens to them. That kind of care hits differently, especially when so much of the public conversation around immigration is cold and abstract and dehumanizing. One volunteer put it simply, "These families are our neighbors. We're reminding them they're seen and valued, no matter the policies." That line cuts through a lot of noise. But because immigration debates tend to happen at a distance, they're framed in numbers, enforcement, strategies, and talking points. What gets lost are the ordinary details. Kids who need winter boots, parents who worry every time there's a knock at the door, families who are trying to celebrate holidays while carrying a constant low-grade fear that everything could change overnight. Operation Midway Bliss didn't pretend to fix the system. It didn't claim to solve immigration policy. It did something far more grounded. It addressed what was directly in front of it. People in need. A moment of fear. A season that's supposed to be about welcome and shelter. And yes, the symbolism matters here. The organizers explicitly frame this effort around the idea of welcoming strangers, a theme deeply rooted in the Christmas story itself. That image of the Holy Family, searching for shelter, turned away again and again, is one that many people hear every year. This time, instead of just hearing it, a group of Chicagoans decided to live it. That's not performative compassion, that's applied compassion. Another element of the effort was the inclusion of what they called whistle kits. These kits, coordinated through a related community network, are meant to help alert families if ICE agents are spotted in the area. It's not dramatic. It's not confrontational. It's neighbors looking out for neighbors, using information to reduce fear and keep people safe. That part of the story is important because it shows that kindness doesn't mean naivety. It wasn't charity detached from reality. It was care paired with awareness, support paired with preparation, joy paired with honesty about the moment these families are living in. And that's what makes this such a powerful feel-good story. It doesn't deny the fear. It meets it head on and says, we can't erase this, but we can soften it. We can stand with you inside it. Think about what that means for a child. Imagine being a kid who's picked up on adult anxiety all year long, who's heard whispers about raids and deportation, who's felt the tension in every room every time the news is on. And then imagine waking up on Christmas morning to toys, warm clothes, and the unmistakable sense that someone, somewhere, cared enough to show up. That kind of moment sticks. Not because of the toy itself, but because of the feeling underneath it. Safety, even if temporary. Belonging, even if fragile. This is what people mean when they talk about community. Not in the abstract, but in action. People using their time, money, and skills to take care of one another when systems fall short or actively cause harm. It's also a reminder that resistance doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like packing groceries, writing notes, delivering coats, creating joy where fear was supposed to win. Chicago has a long history of that kind of quiet defiance. Mutual aid networks, sanctuary efforts, neighbors stepping in when official responses don't. Operation Midway Bliss fits squarely in that tradition. It's not about grandstanding. It's about showing up. And here's the thing. Stories like this don't make it into headlines nearly as often as they should, because they don't fit neatly into outrage cycles. There's no villain monologue, no viral confrontation, just people doing good work for other people. But that doesn't make it small. In fact, it makes it essential. Because while policy battles rage on and rhetoric hardens, the fabric of a society is held together by moments like this. By ordinary people deciding that fear won't be the loudest voice in the room. Operation Midway Bliss didn't change immigration law, but it changed mornings, it changed meals, it changed how a few hundred people experienced a holiday that could have been swallowed up by dread. And in a season that talks a lot about peace on earth and goodwill towards others, that feels like something worth holding on to. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. All right, everyone, I want to thank you for taking the time to download and listen to this episode. I want to wish you the happiest of holidays, the merriest of Christmases. We'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. But obviously this is the last episode before Christmas. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to find out what you think of the podcast, what you thought of this episode, criticisms, critiques, compliments, ideas, whatever. You can reach out to the podcast on any of the social media platforms that we use. The links to all of those are on the Linktree page, and the address for the Linktree page is in the episode description. You can also reach out to the podcast via email if you like. The email address is neighboroTleftpodcast@gmail.com. So, as the holiday approaches, I'll ask you what I always ask you. Stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of holiday you'd wish for others.